They thought they took an ordinary nurse. They had no idea. She belonged to a man who rules the underworld. The man holding the serrated blade to Calista's throat told her she was a nobody, a nameless nurse who made the mistake of playing hero. He didn't notice the way she looked at the security camera with pity, not for herself, but for him. Because on her finger sat a band of black obsidian, a silent signal that the most feared man in Macau was already dismantling the city to find her. They thought they had kidnapped a victim. They didn't realize they had just triggered a total eclipse of the underworld. Before we witness the moment the Dragon of Macau descends to reclaim his queen, ensure you are part of our inner circle by hitting subscribe. Join the 1% who never miss these high-stakes reveals. And as you watch Calista's chilling composure in the face of death, I want to hear from you. If you held a secret that could burn a whole city to the ground, would you stay silent to survive, or would you light the match? Drop your answer in the comments, like this video, and let's see just how far a man will go for the woman who owns his soul. Macau is a city built on two things: neon lights and blood-soaked secrets. In the sterile, high-pressure wards of the city's elite clinics, Calista Monroe was a surgical ghost. To her patients, she was just the American nurse with steady hands. But beneath the scrubs, Calista carried a secret that kept the city's monsters at bay. She was the forbidden light of Xiao Junquan, the undisputed Dragon of Macau. A man whose name was never spoken in public, only felt in the sudden, terrifying silence of a room. To the world, he was a myth of violence. To Calista, he was the man who promised that as long as she wore his obsidian ring, no hand in Asia would ever dare to touch her. But in the underworld, promises are made of glass. During a high society gala, the Jade Triad launched a brutal extraction to kidnap a tech moguls daughter. Calista didn't run. She stood her ground, using her own body to shield the child. But as the smoke cleared, Calista was gone, forced into a black van and vanished from the grid. The Triad thinks they've found Junquan's pressure point. They are about to learn that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. The clock is ticking, the city is shutting down, and the dragon is no longer hiding in the shadows. The air inside the Grand Lisboa ballroom usually smelled of expensive peonies and vintage champagne, but in a heartbeat, it turned to the metallic tang of gunpowder and ozone. The crystal chandeliers above didn't just flicker, they shattered, raining down like a localized storm of diamonds. One moment, Calista was adjusting a bandage for a clumsy socialite in the powder room. The next, she was thrust into a nightmare of tactical precision. The men in matte black gear didn't move like street thugs. They moved like ghosts with a purpose. As the screaming intensified, Callista's medical instincts overrode her fear. While the city's elite scrambled for the exits, she saw 6-year-old Aloan heart frozen in the center of the dance floor, a tiny island of blue silk in a sea of encroaching shadows. "Stay down." Callista's voice cut through the chaos, firm and practiced. She lunged, wrapping her body around the child just as a spray of bullets turned a nearby ice sculpture into slush. For a few seconds, the world was a blur of heavy boots and muffled commands in a dialect of Cantonese that sounded like grinding stone. Calista felt a rough hand seize the collar of her gown. She looked up, meeting the cold, dead eyes of a man whose face was a map of scars. He didn't want the girl for ransom, he wanted the girl as a message. But when he felt the resistance of Callista's grip, his gaze shifted to her hand. The ballroom light surged for a fleeting second, catching the deep, light-absorbing surface of the black obsidian ring on her finger. The attacker paused, a flicker of hesitation, or perhaps recognition, crossing his features. It was a momentary glitch in his lethal programming. "Please," Calista whispered, her voice a jarring contrast to the violence. "She's just a child." The man's grip didn't loosen, it tightened. He realized that while the girl was a prize, this woman with the steady eyes and the forbidden ring was something much more valuable, a lever long enough to move the world. He didn't just want Aloan anymore. "Take them both," he hissed. As a heavy blindfold was shoved over her eyes, Calista felt the sudden, terrifying weight of her secret identity collapsing. She had spent years trying to be the light in Junquan's dark world, but as the van door slammed shut, she realized she had just invited that darkness to consume everything she touched. The city was already fading into the distance, and as the engine roared, a single thought chilled her blood: Junquan wouldn't just come for her, he would make sure there was nothing left of Macau to come back to. The transition from the screeching tires of the kidnapping van to the memory of that night was like plunging into deep, still water. 3 years ago, the rain in Macau hadn't felt like a threat, it felt like a curtain, hiding them from a world that would never understand their union. There were no cameras, no silk-clad socialites, and no towering floral arrangements. Instead, there was a small, centuries-old chapel tucked into a crumbling alleyway where the smell of incense fought against the salt of the South China Sea. Calista stood in a simple white dress, her heart hammering against her ribs, not out of fear, but out of a dizzying, terrifying devotion. Across from her stood Xiao Junquan. He wasn't the dragon in that moment. He wasn't the man who ordered the silence of his enemies with a flick of his wrist. He was just a man with eyes like dark velvet, looking at her as if she were the only thing in the universe that was truly real. "In my world, Calista, love is a liability," he had whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to ground her. "To be mine is to carry a target. Are you certain you want to walk into the eclipse?" She hadn't hesitated. She had seen the man behind the myth, the one who sat in silence after a long day, the one whose hand trembled only when he touched her. "I've spent my life healing wounds, Junquan. I'm not afraid of yours." He had reached into a small velvet box, pulling out a band carved from pure, midnight black obsidian. It didn't sparkle like a diamond, it drank the light. As he slid it onto her finger, the stone felt unnaturally cold, then surged with the heat of her own skin. "This isn't just a ring," he said, his gaze locking onto hers with a sudden, sharp intensity. "It is a vow. It means that my shadow follows you wherever you go. It means that if anyone lays a finger on you, I will not just find them. I will erase the very memory of them from the earth." The memory shattered as the van hit a pothole, jolting Calista back to the cold reality of the present. Her blindfold was damp with sweat, and the child, Eloan, was trembling against her side. Calista squeezed the girl's hand, her thumb brushing against the smooth surface of the obsidian. The ring was no longer a beautiful memory, it was a beacon. She knew Junquan's promise wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a tactical certainty. And somewhere in the dark heart of the city, the dragon had just felt the tether snap. The silence in Xiao Junquan's penthouse was more violent than any explosion. He stood before a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass, watching the neon pulse of Macau, his reflection a motionless shadow against the glowing city. In his hand, a mobile device displayed a single, frozen frame from the gala security feed, Calista being shoved into a black van, her hand outstretched, the obsidian ring flashing like a dark star. He didn't scream. He didn't break the glass. He simply exhaled, a sound like a winter wind through a graveyard. "Seal it," he said. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence. Behind him, a row of lieutenants, men who had survived wars and prison, visibly paled. They knew what that command meant. It was the Black Protocol, a contingency planned but never used. Within minutes, the heartbeat of the city began to falter. On the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge, the world's longest sea crossing, the massive toll gates suddenly hissed shut. Thousands of tons of steel groaned as the barriers locked. Digital signboards that usually flashed tourist welcomes flickered and died, replaced by a single, terrifying word in stark red: closed. Traffic backed up for miles, a glittering snake of headlights trapped between the dark sea and the unyielding gates. Ferries carrying high rollers were ordered back to the docks by patrol boats that appeared like sharks in the mist. The airports went dark, the runways were blocked by heavy armored vehicles. In a city that thrives on movement, the sudden stillness was deafening. Junquan turned away from the window, his tailored suit jacket discarded to reveal the intricate ink of a dragon coiling up his neck, its tail disappearing beneath his collar. He picked up a burner phone and dialed a number that hadn't been called in a decade. "I don't care about the triad's demands," he said to the voice on the other end, his eyes flat and devoid of humanity. "I don't care about the girl. I want my wife. Until she is back in this room, not a single soul, not a politician, not a billionaire, not a beggar, leaves this island. Tell the Jade Triad they have 1 hour before I start burning the docks from the bottom up." As he hung up, a heavy tremor of realization rippled through the underworld. The dragon wasn't just looking for a hostage. He was holding the entire city hostage until he found her. The air in the shipping container was thick with the smell of rust and salt, vibrating with the distant, rhythmic thrum of the harbor. Calista sat on a cold metal crate, her hands cinched behind her back with heavy-duty zip ties. Beside her, Alolan had finally fallen into a fitful, terrified sleep, but Callista's mind was moving with the cold, calculated precision of a surgeon. The guard assigned to watch them was a jittery man in his late 20s, his hand trembling slightly as he gripped a submachine gun. He was pacing, his eyes darting toward the heavy steel door every time the wind howled. "You should sit down," Calista said, her voice startlingly calm in the gloom. "Your pulse is visible in your neck. It's too fast, and it's uneven." The guard spun around, aiming the barrel at her chest. "Shut up, nurse. No one asked you." "I'm not trying to be difficult," Calista replied, her fingers working rhythmically against the plastic binds behind her back, searching for the structural weakness she knew existed. "But your left eyelid is drooping, and you're sweating despite the chill. It's Brugada syndrome, a silent heart defect. In this much stress, your heart could simply stop." The guard froze. He wiped his forehead, his hand coming away slick. "You're lying. You're trying to get in my head." "I'm a doctor of the underworld," Calista countered, her voice dropping to a low, clinical whisper. "I've seen men stronger than you drop dead from a sudden arrhythmia. Feel your chest. Does it feel like a bird is trapped in there, fluttering?" The man's hand instinctively drifted toward his sternum. The seed of doubt was planted, and in a high-tension environment, doubt is a virus. As he distracted himself with his own heartbeat, Calista felt the plastic of the zip tie bite into her skin, but she didn't flinch. She used the sharp edge of the obsidian ring, the one thing they hadn't dared to strip from her, to saw through the nylon. Snap. The sound was masked by a sudden blast of a ship's horn outside. Calista didn't move her hands yet. She kept them positioned behind her, her eyes locked on the guard's widening pupils. "If you let me check your pulse, I can tell you if you're in immediate danger," she offered, leaning forward. The guard took a step toward her, his weapon lowered as the primal fear of his own mortality overrode his orders. He didn't realize that Calista wasn't looking at his heart, she was looking at the radio on his belt. She knew that outside these walls, her husband was turning Macau into a graveyard. But inside this room, she was the one holding the scalpel. The neon glow of the Kotai strip was suffocating, a canopy of artificial light that offered no warmth. In the center of the district, at the mouth of a triad-controlled warehouse, a crowd of low-level enforcers had gathered, their faces ashen in the flickering light of a broken street lamp. They had found Wei, the Jade Triad's most ruthless lieutenant, a man who prided himself on being untouchable. Now, he was slumped against a shipping crate, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at a city that had turned against him. He wasn't dead from a bullet, he had been neutralized with the terrifying, surgical efficiency of a man who knew exactly where the human spirit breaks. Pinned to the center of Wei's tactical vest with a gleaming silver dagger was a simple piece of heavy cream cardstock. The handwriting was elegant, almost scholarly, contrasting sharply with the brutality of the scene. "Give her back, or I burn the docks." All of them. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. The message was written in the ink of a man who didn't negotiate, he simply stated the future. The docks weren't just a location, they were the Triad's lungs, the entry point for every illicit scent that flowed through their veins. To burn them was to suffocate the Empire. But the warning went deeper than the ink. Beside the note, resting in the palm of Wei's hand, was a single, spent shell casing from a caliber used only by the dragon's personal guard. It was a promise that the next one wouldn't be found in a hand, it would be found in a skull. Panic began to ripple through the ranks like a slow-acting poison. One by one, phones began to vibrate. Orders were being barked from the high command, but the voices were laced with a frantic, stuttering edge. The shut-down bridges and the dark airports had been the warning shot, this was the first incision. The Triad leader, a man known as Iron Fong, stood on his balcony overlooking the harbor, clutching the report of Wei's discovery. For the first time in 30 years, his hands shook. He had thought he was stealing a nurse to win a war. He realized now he had stolen a goddess to invite an apocalypse. "Find out where they are holding her," Fong hissed to his shadow. "Now. Before he reaches the water." But as a low, ominous rumble of thunder rolled across the South China Sea, Fong realized the dragon wasn't waiting for an answer. He was already breathing fire. The atmosphere in the shipping container shifted from tense to suffocating. Iron Fang's second in command, a man whose bravado was usually as thick as his neck, stepped into the dim light. He had heard the reports of Wei's body and the burn the docks ultimatum. His confidence was fraying like a worn cable. He approached Calista, his boots heavy against the corrugated floor. "The nurse has a lot of opinions for someone in zip ties," he growled, reaching out to grab her chin. "But let's see what makes you so special that the city is turning upside down for a foreigner." His eyes caught a glint of movement. Calista had freed her hands, but she remained perfectly still, her palms resting flat against the crate. It was too late to hide it. The guard snatched her hand, pulling it into the beam of his flashlight. The obsidian ring didn't reflect the light, it seemed to pull the beam into a void. It was a piece of volcanic glass, cold and ancient, etched with a microscopic dragon coiled around a single, sharp character. The guard's breath hitched. He didn't just recognize the jewelry, he recognized the myth. This wasn't a wedding band from a local jeweler. This was the Black Vow, a piece of the dragon's own history. In the Macau underworld, this ring was more than a symbol, it was a portable death warrant for anyone who saw it without the owner's permission. "The obsidian vow," he whispered, his voice cracking. He scrambled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet, his face draining of color until he looked like a ghost. You aren't just a nurse. You're his." The other men in the room, seasoned killers who had stared down police and rival gangs, froze. The air grew cold, the kind of cold that precedes a predator's strike. They had been told they were kidnapping a lever, a way to pressure the tech moguls. Instead, they realized they were trapped in a cage with a sleeping lion's heart, and the lion was already at the door. Calista looked up at them, her expression devoid of the fear they expected. "He told me once that the ring was a promise," she said softly, her voice echoing in the sudden silence. "He promised that if anyone ever made me feel afraid, he would make sure they never felt anything else ever again." Outside, the distant sound of a single, low-frequency hum began to vibrate through the metal walls. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a ship. It was the sound of a tactical blackout. One by one, the lights on the docks began to wink out, plunging the world into a total, terrifying eclipse. The darkness outside wasn't just the absence of light, it was a physical weight. One by one, the industrial floodlights illuminating the dockyards had died, leaving the shipping container an isolated island in a sea of ink. Inside, the air felt thin. The kidnappers were no longer captors, they were prey, and they knew it. The man who had discovered the ring was now hyperventilating, his back pressed against the corrugated steel wall. He clutched his rifle, but the weapon felt like a toy against the overwhelming silence of the blackout. "He's here," the man whimpered, his eyes darting to every shadow. "You don't understand. Junquan doesn't use doors. He doesn't make noise. He just appears." "Shut up," the lead guard hissed, though his own hand was white-knuckled around his sidearm. He turned to Calista, his bravado replaced by a frantic, jagged desperation. "Tell him to stop. Use your phone, your ring, whatever it is. Tell him we'll let you go." Calista didn't move. She sat with Aloan tucked behind her, her silhouette calm and regal against the chaos. "It's too late for a phone call," she said, her voice a soft, haunting melody in the dark. "The moment you put me in that van, you broke the silence. My husband doesn't negotiate with men who make him break a promise." A muffled thud vibrated through the floor, the sound of something heavy hitting the roof of the container. Then, the rhythmic snip-snip-snip of wire cutters. The guards began to fire blindly at the ceiling, the muzzle flashes illuminating the room in strobing, nightmarish bursts. But there was no return fire. Only the sound of the radio on the lead guard's belt suddenly crackling to life. Instead of his teammates' voices, a low, rhythmic sound filled the air. It was a heartbeat. Slow. Steady. Predatory. One of the younger guards dropped his weapon and fell to his knees, sobbing. The psychological toll of being hunted by a ghost had stripped away their training. They were trapped in a metal box, and the dragon was peeling it open like a discarded toy. "Please," the leader gasped, turning back to Calista, the barrel of his gun shaking as he aimed it at her. "Tell him." The words died in his throat. The heavy steel doors of the container didn't swing open, they were ripped outward with a screech of tortured metal. The moonlight spilled in, framing a silhouette that was darker than the night itself. The silhouette in the doorway didn't move like a man, it moved like an inevitable consequence. Seo Junquan stepped into the moonlight, his tailored black suit pristine, a stark contrast to the grime and terror of the shipping container. Behind him, the docks were a graveyard of silent, downed men. His personal guard had moved through the triad's perimeter like a scalpel through silk. The lead kidnapper, his mind fractured by the pressure, screamed and leveled his weapon. Before his finger could even find the trigger, a flash of silver streaked through the air. A tactical blade buried itself in the man's shoulder with surgical precision, pinning him to the back wall of the container. He didn't even have time to shriek before the dragon was upon him. Junquan's movements were a blur of controlled lethality. He moved with total tactical dominance, disarming the remaining guards not with flamboyant violence, but with the cold efficiency of a man clearing a path. A snapped wrist here, a crushed windpipe there, it was over in less than 10 seconds. The younger guards who had already surrendered didn't even look up, they remained curled on the floor, knowing that in the presence of the dragon, even breathing felt like a transgression. Junquan finally stopped, his shadow falling over Calista. The air in the container, previously thick with the smell of fear, suddenly felt clean. He didn't look at the groaning men or the discarded weapons. His entire universe had narrowed down to the woman sitting on the metal crate. He reached out, his hand, usually so steady when holding a weapon, trembling almost imperceptibly as he cupped her face. His thumb brushed over a small smudge of dirt on her cheek, his touch as light as a prayer. "Calista," he whispered. The name sounded like both a vow and a confession. "I knew you'd find the ring," she replied, her voice steady, though her eyes shimmered with the first signs of relief. He didn't answer with words. He simply pulled her to her feet, his arm wrapping around her waist with a possessive strength that signaled the end of her ordeal. He looked down at Aloan, who was staring up at him with wide, wondering eyes. With a curt nod to his men, the child was lifted gently by a tactical medic. Junquan turned back to the lead kidnapper, who was still pinned to the wall, gasping for air. The dragon's eyes weren't filled with rage, they were empty. And that was far more terrifying. "You touched what is mine," Junquan said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the very bones of the container. "Now, I am going to show you why the shadows in this city belong to me." The morning sun broke over the Macau skyline, not with its usual neon garishness, but with a soft, forgiving gold. In the private wing of the city's most prestigious hospital, the chaos of the previous night felt like a fever dream that had finally broken. Calista moved through the room with the quiet grace of a woman who had reclaimed her soul. Her scrubs were clean, her hand steady as she checked the vitals of young Aloan Hart. The child, tucked under a weighted blanket, watched Calista with a quiet reverence. To the world, Calista was the nurse who survived. To Aloan, she was the guardian who had stood between her and the abyss. "You're safe now," Calista whispered, adjusting the foredrip with a precision that calmed the girl's racing heart. "The shadows are gone." Outside the glass partition, the hospital hallways were uncharacteristically silent. The surgical ghost was no longer a secret. The elite staff gave Calista a wide berth, their eyes reflecting a new kind of respect, the kind reserved for royalty. They had seen the black armored SUVs that escorted her to the entrance, they had heard how the city's pulse had flatlined the moment she disappeared. In the far corner of the darkened hallway, nearly invisible against the mahogany paneling, stood Seo Junquan. He didn't enter the room. He knew that his presence brought the scent of gunpowder and the weight of the underworld into a space meant for healing. Instead, he watched her through the glass, his hands clasped behind his back. The obsidian ring on Callista's finger caught a stray beam of sunlight, flashing a dark, defiant spark as she smoothed Aloan's hair. Junquan felt a rare, sharp pang of pride. He had spent his life tearing things down to protect his empire, but she was the only one who could build something beautiful in its wake. His territory was reclaimed. The Jade Triad was a memory, their docks reduced to ash and their leaders vanished into the silence of the South China Sea. The city was moving again, the bridges open and the casinos humming, but the power dynamic had shifted forever. Macau had a king who ruled the night, but it finally realized it had a queen who governed the day. As Calista turned and caught his gaze through the glass, a small, knowing smile touched her lips. She was a healer, and he was a warlord, two halves of a whole that the city would never dare to challenge again. The vow was kept. The dragon was sated. And in the heart of the city of glass, the healer's reign had just begun.